Yes, welcome everyone to this, I believe, the final plenary session of today. There's one more speaker after us, but we're the final big group on stage. Welcome everyone. Since we are the youth panel, we decided to do something that hasn't been done before at this summit. We handed out red and green cards. You'll find them on your seat or next to your seat. And you can use those later in our session, and I'll tell you when, no worries. Our panel today is called How Can the G7 Deliver for Today's Youth and Future Generations? How can the G7 deliver for today's youth and future generations? Youth participation has been on the rise at international forums. We see young people making heartfelt speeches, appealing to decision makers to take actions. We see and hear decision makers applauding youth and underlining the importance of youth engagement. But when we talk to youth in our programs, they seldom feel heard. They don't feel that their demands, their criticisms, their constructive input is being used. And that's especially obvious when we look at the topic of climate change and the climate crisis and the much needed climate action. Some may argue that this lack of representation, as the youth would call it, is something that appears across sectors. Many groups are not represented, but we feel that when it comes to climate crisis, it is especially important to listen to the younger generation. And in this final plenary session, we would like to discuss this challenge and related challenges. We would like to discuss how youth can actually give a meaningful input to policy debates and inform policy discussions. What are the barriers to this engagement? And we would like to engage in a dialogue, maybe even an intergenerational dialogue with you here in the audience and everyone at their screens. So before we jump in, let me introduce our four wonderful panelists. And we have with us today Carolina Claus. Carolina is currently the co-chair of the Youth7 Summit, so that's the Youth Y7 Summit, under the German presidency. She has been active in youth organizations and political youth work for almost 10 years. She's currently a PhD student in educational science at the European University of Flensburg and is working on the topic of educational equity from an international comparative perspective. We are also joined by Adama Bamba. Adama is the current vice chairperson of the Africa Youth Advisory Board on Disaster Risk Reduction under the African Union Commission. He's also one of the participants of the African American Leadership Academy by the German Development Institute. Also with us today is Gina Cortes Valderrama. She's a Colombian feminist, an activist advocating for gender-responsive climate action from a decolonial and intersectional approach at the organization Women Engage for a Common Future. She's currently the co-focal point of the UNFCCC Women and Gender constituency and an active member of the collective Aluna Minga, leading the campaign Life, Not Coal. She is also an ambassador of the Young Global Changes program of the Global Solutions Initiative. And to my left, Sophie Daud. She is the award-winning Chief Executive Officer of the Future Leaders Network, a not-for-profit organization that aims to discover and develop the next generation of leaders. In 2021, so last year, Sophie was the chair of the Youth7 process in the UK, and her team oversaw the consultation and involvement of over 50,000 young people into the process. So please join me in welcoming our four wonderful panelists to the stage. Thank you very much. So we would like to start this discussion with a first round of questions. And my first question is to you, Carolina. You've been engaged in the Youth 7 process this year. And last Friday, I believe, you handed over your communique to the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. If you had to rank your recommendations, what would be your #1 recommendation to the German G7 presidency and why?
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation, Ole, and also for the introduction. I think there are several #1 recommendations, actually, but definitely there's one very outstanding recommendation on YPS. So we created a task force on youth peace and security in the Y7 process, and yeah, we've been talking about the topic of YPS a lot for the several months. And our recommendation builds on different resolutions made by the United Nations Security Council on YPS, and it highlights the important role of young people in peace-building processes. And instead of seeing young people as troublemakers, for example, like we see young people as peace builders, as peacemakers. And that's why our recommendation highlights the importance of young people, like involving them in peace building processes, also working with youth organizations together and implementing national action plans. Yeah, this would be our #1 recommendation.
Thank you. So let's go to Sophie next, because you were in charge last year and you gave recommendations to the UK government. And if you had to point out one that was particularly successful, one that made it maybe even into the communique or got picked up by the government, and maybe you can also point out one that kind of fell off the radar. And we can maybe explore later why that was, but maybe let us know what was the most successful one and maybe which one didn't have as much success.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ola, and thank you for the invitation to be here. So last year, health was a big priority for the whole world in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. But what young people kept telling us was their top priority amongst 6 of the 8 countries that were participating in the G7, which includes the European Union. It was the top priority for them. The top priority for 6 of those countries was mental health. They were seeing world leaders prioritize physical health over well-being. And young people were really worried about that. And actually, for the 2 other countries, it came second in their list of priorities. And this was something that I both raised directly with the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, when I met with him just ahead of our summit. We mentioned this to the G7 Sherpa at our summit. We said, we want to see mental health being recognised as an issue by world leaders, and we want to see you commit funding to it. Well, I think we got halfway there, is the honest answer. It appears we managed to force a conversation between world leaders about mental health, which I will take as a real priority when it hadn't been on their agenda at all, but no money. So, I mean, that's probably my kind of side that didn't get picked up. And actually, what we see often with G7s is a lot of words, warm words, recognition, but actually not always followed up with the money to make that happen. So that would be the bit that we're definitely chasing up on year in, year out. And I worked very closely with Carolina to keep mental health as a priority across both of our years.
Okay, thank you. So we've heard from 2 representatives of the Youth 7 track. Let's maybe broaden our horizon somewhat. Adama, you're from Côte d'Ivoire. You've been here at the Think7 Summit for the first time, a summit like this. Maybe you can give us some reflections on the Think7 Summit and maybe already point out some things that you think could even be improved, if that's even possible.
Hello. Okay, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And I would like to also thank the GIE because I'm attending the African German Leadership Academy with GIE. And yeah, let's say about the Think7 Summit, I think what is a bit missing is like we need more representative of civil society, which is working with vulnerable people coming from developing countries. Sometimes their voices are really not well raised during, let's say, huge event like this. I think we need that, and we need also experts coming from our different countries that also contribute from their perspective and from our real needs. But I would like also to thank the procedure that I'm passing through, because I got knowledge from the GIE explaining me like what is policy, developing governance, what is that. When you are youth and you have the better understanding of governance and you attend this kind of summit, I think you finish to empower youth, and then you give space to youth to really highlight the need. I think this is the best way. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a really interesting point, I think. So we talk about how to include youth into the G7 process. And what you mentioned is that at summits like these, when we get think tanks together, that might also be a good place to bring in people from vulnerable communities and youth, and let the think tanks also be another transmitter of the messages to the G7. That's a really interesting point. Gina, you also work a lot with communities that are affected, especially by climate change. Would you like to build on Adama's point?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you. I don't know how this works. Yeah, I think we have discussed a lot about the intersections of multiple crises that go from the pandemic, that go from wars and conflict, and also from climate crisis. And these crises have made more visible, more evident, different structural inequalities. And either way, how we analyze it, we can say that all these different crises are part of one, maybe a political one, maybe a behavioral one. No matter how we look at them, I believe that they grow in the same pot. They are rooted under the same system of power imbalances, of extraction, of violence that is perpetuating those inequalities. And these inequalities, these multiple forms of oppression, respond to a same colonial history. A colonial history that we are not discussing, that we are not addressing, rather that we are naming it as development aid or assistance to other countries. When it comes to climate justice, or to the climate crisis, I see that we are not really approaching the principle of climate justice and understanding how climate justice is looking, diving, analyzing the legacy of colonialism in the local, in the regional, and in the national strategies, plans, pathways for climate action. The IPCC report, the last reports, they were very clear. If we consider climate justice, we are going to be able to shift these pathways for a sustainable future, to reshape climate action to a one that really puts the people and the nature in the focus.
Yeah, that's a great addition there, Gina. Thank you very much. Putting people in the center, that is also what Y7 is about. And Sophie, you in the beginning already alluded to one of your successes, putting mental health on the agenda of the UK government. Can you share with us how you did it? Maybe some principles of how, maybe the think tanks can learn something from that as well, how you get your positions across to political leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I come at this in the spirit of learning. And one of the fortunate things about the G7 is that it's kind of predictable when the G7 or Y7 presidency is going to land with you. So when I first started my Y7 engagement back in 2016, I remember thinking, 2021, that's our year. So I've been thinking about this for a really long time. So when we were planning our youth participation, our Y7 input into the G7 presidency last year, we started from an analysis of the barriers, of the things that had gotten in the way of good youth participation in previous years. We found three big problems, and we constructed a theory of change around those problems to hopefully deliver better outcomes for young people. The first thing that we found was that world leaders typically thought that the young people who participated in the Y7 were kind of oddballs. They were like, they don't represent real young people. They're like these weird policy wonks. They don't count. And actually, I mean, they had a sort of point there. So there does tend to be a certain background of young people who participate in the Y7, partially because it's quite political. It's also quite niche. Like, let's be honest about it. And that was not only a bad thing from a moral perspective, because all young people's voices should be heard in decision-making, but it was also a bad thing from our credibility perspective. And so the first principle that we had was inclusion. We wanted to make sure that every young person's voice had a role to play in our Y7 presidency. And that helped us, as I say, from the both moral and credibility perspective. So to do that, we did a huge outreach campaign when we were recruiting our delegates. And we also included, for the first time in history, a youth forum, which brought young people with real-world lived experience of the Y7 tracks into the Y7. And that was particularly effective. So, for example, we had the daughter of a rural farmer in Wales. We had a young climate refugee as part of our decision-making process. We also required all of our delegates to carry out public consultation so that they were truly reflecting the young people in their society. So the first thing we did, as I say, was inclusion, right? And that was really important to us. The second thing we did was we focused on impact. And I kind of hate to say it, but sometimes we can get a little bit lost in navel gazing, in like writing the perfect recommendation that's like 6 pages long, but like no one listens. No one listens. And so we kind of analysed, you know, what was going wrong with previous recommendations. And the thing we found out was they were too long. They were often talking about things that the G7 didn't care about. And finally, they often came too late. So, you know, they came out like 2 weeks before the G7 summit. Well, that's really not very helpful because most G7 negotiations happen ages beforehand. And so we designed our process around making sure that our recommendations were short. They were talking about exactly what world leaders were talking about, and they came out as far in advance as we possibly could, whilst also balancing that crucial inclusion point. But I guess the final thing that I want to talk about, and I guess maybe this relates to our broader theme of the panel, was our third emphasis was on development. And we meant that about the young people who were in our charge and who were part of the Y7. Now, what I want us to steer away from is this idea of kind of young people as like a charity case. Oh, how cute, let's get them involved. Look, they can have a lovely time pretending to be in the G7, how cute. Actually, the thing that we were thinking about is to be properly inclusive, you have to assume everybody knows nothing. And you've got to make sure everyone's equipped with the skills and the knowledge they need to participate really effectively. But more than that, development is about legacy. Those young people, and you know, I'm so proud of some of the young people we work with, have gone on to get scholarships, to get roles in governments, to get roles in think tanks. They are paving the way for the young people who will come behind them. They are not pulling up that ladder. They are offering a welcoming hand. And that development angle was so crucial to us to say, this is not about you. This is about all young people, and you are going to use your time and your role and your voice this year to help young people have a voice next year and the year after. And I hope that paved the way to, you know, ongoing youth participation in the G7 process by focusing on those 3 things: inclusion, impact, and development.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned that there are problems, there are barriers, and I want to shift to Carolina because you're also very familiar with the process of the Youth 7. You invited me, thank you for that invitation again, to your Youth 7 Summit. I visited, and there were very inspiring young people. A lot of them come from universities with a university background. They come from in the case of the G7, from the G7 countries. So some would say they have some privilege maybe to attend these meetings. How do we make these groups possibly more inclusive, and how do we get the youth to talk to the G7 and break down some of those barriers?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you, Sophie, for these contributions, because I can build on that now. So I think there are several problems and a lot of barriers, to be honest, and the first one is that when we're talking about youth participation, as youth organizations, we are talking about a different concept of youth participation than ministries or politicians, political decision makers do. And this is a huge problem because in these kind of formats, like on a global level, civil society and also youth in particular, like our participation is often limited to consultative measures, but it's no real exchange, it's no co-decision making. And this is the first problem. For example, we also experienced this in the Y7 process now. There came a politician and was asking us if we could come up with a slogan or a logo. And this is something we don't actually care about, because we care about the content, we care about organizational things, but the logo doesn't matter to us. But they think this is youth participation, deciding how the logo looks like. So that was really weird. And there are a few other things. I think Sophie mentioned this already. Youth is diverse. Youth is a very diverse group, but often, like you also said, Ole, the representation of youth isn't diverse, and that's a huge problem. This is because participating in these kinds of forums requires a lot of skills. So first and foremost, English language skills might not be a problem in the UK, but here it is for certain young people. It also requires a lot of time. So this, for example, here is my free time activity, which is kind of a weird free time activity, I think for Sophie as well. So yeah, it requires a lot of time, and a lot of young people, they don't have this time because they are studying, they are working. And also, for example, what I experienced in our process working with ministries, we had almost all the working meetings on Saturdays because of the different time zones. And for the ministries, for politicians, it was a huge problem to participate in these kind of working meetings on a Saturday. And then they told me that they can't participate because it's a weekend, and for us it's the only opportunity. So I think they need to be more flexible if they want to engage with civil society and even with young people. And another point is that in these kind of formats, a certain vocabulary is needed, and this excludes a lot of young people. And I also think, because there's always, or like a lot of people are saying that youth is not interested in politics, and I think this is a question of the framing, because if you ask young people if they are interested in politics, they might say no, I don't think so, but they might say no. But if you ask if they are interested in what's going on around, like in the environment, they are always, they always want to engage. They're very interested in, even little kids. Like if there's a new playground or something, they want to have a say how the playground looks like. So I think this is another very important point, that adults need to learn to listen, because young people express their political interest in a different way. And then I think it's way more inclusive also.
I think one international forum where youth are expressing their voice very loudly, and we can hear it, is around climate issues, and especially at the COP venues. There's a lot of youth present, there's a lot of organizations from all walks of life, businesses represented, it's a big event. Gina, you are involved in climate justice work, and you were at the COP. Do forums like the G7 need to become more like the COP?
So one could think that the UNFCCC space and landscape at this climate conference are very inclusive, because they have 9 different constituencies, meaning 9 groups that represent different parts of the civil society. So you have youth, you have indigenous communities, you have farmers. For example, I am part of the Women and Gender constituency, and indeed we are being consultant, we are being participating in different meetings, and also engaging with the presidency, the upcoming and the last presidency, and this is happening. However, and there's a particular point that I would like to take from Caroline, and there are different barriers that do not allow for a significant and a meaningful participation. This is a space dominated by English. All the documents are in English, so we cannot expect that everyone around the world is going to be able to engage and participate actively in this space. Second, if we go back to the COP last year, for those who follow, you could have seen that it was more difficult to enter to this space as for a concert of the Rolling Stones. I mean, this was just unbelievable without going into details about the discriminatory visa processes to get to the United Kingdom. But that's not the only thing. My most frustrating memory from Glasgow was the last day of conclusions. There has been a lot of engaging with the constituencies. At the very last moment, when conclusions were taken, you could see the same group mingling. And this group was made of old, white men. And I do not intend to offend anybody here, but that is what I saw. That's the picture that I took. Women, indigenous, youth were not at the end taking decisions on their present, on their futures, those communities that are in the front lines of climate change. So how inclusive this is, I'm not really sure. And that brings me to a concern that I have in the last days with all the discussions about the Climate Club. And is how the Climate Club or the G7 going to guarantee that this is not a new hierarchical structure that is going to perpetuate neo-colonial behaviors or attitudes or approaches to development in the name of climate action, in the name of just transition. In the past, colonialism has defined the means and the modes of production in name of development. So how is the G7, the G20, and whosoever going to guarantee that this is not a new way of neo-colonial narrative?
Okay, yes, very important points. How is the Climate Club going to be shaped? Some important points that you raised. You also mentioned that COP definitely shouldn't be the prime example for the G7, maybe, to become more inclusive. Adama, you work with communities on the ground in Côte d'Ivoire.
Yeah.
Do you have ideas, suggestions of how these communities and communities like those around the world can actually meaningfully contribute either to the Think7 or other engagement group, or even better, to the G7?
Okay, thank you so much. There is one statement that is really pop in my mind when we talk about policy. You cannot say you are developing policies for youth without youth. That means that you are developing policy for you, not for youth. Yeah, we have to admit, like, you cannot develop policies for people that are not aware that you are developing a policy. And we can take, let's say, the COVID example, because I did a survey on COVID when the COVID started in Africa. Youth was like proactive. They start doing, let's say, awareness about COVID, stuff like this. But when you don't understand the communication languages, as she said, it's difficult for you to be aligned with what is developed or what is going on. Because at the beginning, at the formulation process, they are not there. And their needs are not captured in the formulation process. So your interpretation of the message or the policy you are developing is not the same with the understanding of youth. So at local level, when the policy did not fit with the realities of the communities, it doesn't work. If you do not domesticate the message you develop globally, it will not work. Domesticating global policies means that in every, let's say, continent or country level, or let's say regional, local level, they know and they see the importance of the policy you develop and what they can contribute in. They cannot be really passive and think that this is for them. because like more you are active in a policy, more you get like the understanding of this policy and how it's work. So my, let's say, message to the G7, I think they need to support youth and vulnerable people that are on the ground to understand the importance of the policies, the importance of climate change policies, the importance of, let's say, their contribution, their own contribution in these climate issues. But this will always be, like, say, well assessed or well understood if the needs are really well captured. And I really like, let's say, to use this platform to, let's say, advocate for your support, to help us to understand what is going on and what is our own contribution first, because we need to understand what is our role as stakeholders. Youth are important stakeholders. Particularly in Africa, we are 70% of the population. So if we did not understand the message you develop globally for us, as you say, it's for youth, it's for future generation, but the future generation did not understand what you wrote. That is something that we have to think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adama. Thank you for these words. And now with that, I would like to open it up already to the audience, and we will definitely take questions in a minute. But before that, I would like you to use those red and green cards that we placed, if you like. And I want to do a test round, because what we're trying to do is I will say a statement, a pointed statement, and it would like you to react. If you agree with the statement, you raise the green card, and if you don't, the red card. So we heard a lot, or at times at least, people referred back to the good old days of the G7, when it was a club of men mostly, one woman I guess sometimes, that gathered around a fireplace. And they had constructive discussions, so we were told, not bothered by the public. And there was criticism of the last year when it was just public statements, empty statements that nobody actually cared about. The leaders themselves may not even have listened to each other's statements because it was a public affair. So my statement is, with that in mind, the G7 needs to return to a more productive, but more of a closed shop meeting style to get things done. G7 closed shop to get things done. Okay, I have some green cards here, and I would like to, maybe that's, Sarah, would you like to?
I'm aware that there's some controversy in that, but having worked for the G7 finance track myself, I know what these meetings are like, and I can tell you it's just reading pre-written statements, and basically you know all along what they're saying because those pre-written statements are, you know them before because that's what they say at every meeting. And to be honest, like if it was more closed door and politicians would then like talk with each other very honestly and then have in mind that they need to be inclusive and then they need to listen to the other voices, then I would say yes, like if they're speaking more honestly, then yes, a closed door meeting would actually be beneficial.
Right. Can I have a reaction from the other side to that? Yes, the gentleman over there.
I think your question was misspecified. And no, sir, this is serious, because you could talk about the G7 process, or you can talk about the leaders getting together as a part of that process, but only a small part of that process, in which case there is real value in building personal relationships and not reading off a script. And so what is important is that the process produces an understanding or takes in the information that is reflective of what is going on in society, what the society needs, and ideas on how the policies can evolve. And that decision-making process in the G7 usually happens before the leaders get anywhere close to the venue. That's the critical part, because that's how policy changes. And having the leaders get together and discussing this and saying, you know, we've just agreed to these measures, and don't you think we got to figure out how to make ourselves look better? You can have it both ways. That's why I use both flags.
Thank you very much. So maybe someone on the panel, is that the way forward? So we have constructive closed door meetings, but also have engagement groups to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is I probably agree with that, actually. I mean, otherwise, kind of what is the G7 if not just like a slightly smaller version of a, as we've kind of pointed out, quite selective, quite dubious historically group of countries? Wouldn't it be, you know, it's just trying to mirror the United Nations if everyone comes in and reads out a pre-written statement? Actually, the purpose of this group when it was founded was this kind of close-knit group of leaders who could discuss the world's most difficult problems in a safe environment and solve problems together in kind of a collaborative, collegiate atmosphere. I mean, how could you do that if you have 1 million cameras pointed at you and kind of everyone watching your words? So I do think there is space, and there should be space for world leaders to have that discussion. You know, it's pretty lonely at the top. I would like to think that if I was Prime Minister, I'd have a bunch of like 6 or 7 people that I could lean on to discuss some of the biggest issues I was facing. So I think that's crucial, but you cannot ignore, as the gentleman just said, the voices of others. Without that, it is just a group of old men talking, and that's not useful for anyone.
I like how you're worried about mental health, even when it comes to our global leaders and their mental health. Gina, I feel that the tide is turning somewhat. So we are closer to a closed shop design of the G7. Gina, what do you have to say? How do we bring in the youth and other voices into the process most productively?
I think we really need to I think I can agree with that, because I have seen that happening at COP. That's kind of my sense of what happens, that at the last day, things have been already arranged and it has happened, and maybe I don't think it's to open it to the press and to everyone and to the cameras, because I think that makes a lot of pressure on how open you are. Yeah, when you have all the media around it, it's a very, very difficult thing. But I do emphasize in the point that we need some kind of representation, participation there at the space, at the decision-making space, because otherwise it's going to be the same old people, the same structure every time, and then we're not going to really evolve in the conversation. It's not going to be diverse, and what we are going to increase is more these we and you, and then we relate to you in a different way.
I had a reaction, someone waving with the red card over there. It's here from you. Thank you.
I can't believe we're having this conversation in 2022. You are talking about a process that was evolved in 20 years ago. 20 years ago, people didn't even have mobile phones that they could use every day. In San Jose, we have participatory budgeting. So people can get around and they can vote on what items they want the mayor's budget to cover. We have crowdfunding in the Zelensky comedy. That's how he got elected as president. There's a whole new way to participate. But we don't have, the choice is not open or closed. We have so many ways to engage. We have Glassdoor. we have all Yelp. So just reminding you of what we've got. The technology is allowing many voices, but we don't have the institutional frameworks to use these new channels.
Yeah, thank you for that input. I think, I mean, some of the channels have already been mentioned here. I very much like the idea of bringing in more diverse groups into engagements group, like the Think7 and other procedures have been mentioned. You have brought in about 50,000 youth into your process. So there are definitely many ways of including youth into the process, and there can't be any excuse for not doing so. But let me give one last controversial maybe statement, which is directed at the youth advocates. Youth advocates should not focus too much on G7. Instead, the pressure should come from outside. They should not be co-opted. They should not be domesticated by G7 leaders. Instead, focus on the street protest. Do you agree that the focus of youth engagement should be outside of the G7 rather than inside? And now I have to look for the green ones. I see one, Stormy over there, I believe, has both up. Okay, that's fine. I'll take both. I'll take both. And maybe then you next over there. Stormy, do you want to comment? And then you next.
Yeah, sure, I would love to. So I think I very strongly believe there needs to be pressure from the outside. There needs to be visibility, there needs to be on the street, there needs to be concerted action, and it needs to be on TV, it needs to be on social media and everywhere to put pressure on the system. On the other hand, I think for developing actionable, timely, workable, effective solutions, I think you also need to be, or youth need to be inside the system and work with people, talk with people. And so I think what you're doing is exactly the right thing. You're doing both at the same time. So chewing gum and working at the same time. That's why I raised both cards.
Thank you. We had another reaction over there. Yes, yeah, please.
I was both sides. I was an activist in Gezi movement. Now I am in the scientific side. I'm doing a constructive resistance in this platform. I think both sides are important because creativities are direct now in the streets. We find a lot of new methods to show our identity in a non-violent way, to build a structure where the grassroots wants to grow in the cities especially. But then when we make it possible to transform this knowledge from the grassroots to this level of all the top-down institutions, then it can change something, what I believe. So we can use both sides, be the part of change from using the creativity and transform it for a common future together. Thank you.
I think it's great. There's so many ways that have been mentioned of different ways of integrating youth into the process.
If I can add to that,
Sure.
I think it's a matter of creativity, and it kind of reminds us the value of diversity in different levels, at different skills, at different interests, at different stages. So I think we need, and it's for climate action, for instance, is not only about how scientists or how farmers or how people directly engaged to this should react, but how everyone has a way to contribute and to fight and transform a different system. So I think that's the beauty of our nature, that's the beauty of us, that's the diversity that we have.
Thank you. Yeah, Adama, please go.
Okay, I do agree with what she said. Like, it should be from both sides. You know, generally, like when there is movement outside and decision makers are inside, sometimes it's influenced a bit. It's influenced a bit, but it should also capture like the need of youth. Those are supposed to be represented inside as well. So I think diversity of approaches is good.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I saw more hands raised over there with the green card. And then...
Just one very practical solution for engaging the youth more, and that's to give them the vote at a much earlier age. I mean, it's just ridiculous that we leave voting age to 18. And I'm sort of reminded of a debate in our household where my 12-year-old daughter was arguing with my Brexiteer father-in-law and saying, it's okay for you, Grandpa, you know, you've only got another 10, 20 years of this. This is the rest of my life. I should have a vote and you shouldn't. Which was a pretty interesting point, really. But I do think that, you know, fiascos like Brexit wouldn't have happened had we given the vote to teenagers. And, you know, not only to 16-year-olds, but on things like climate change. You know, one trusts people like Greta Thunberg much more so than our Prime Minister. So very practical solution, give votes to 12-year-olds, if not 10-year-olds, I would say.
Interesting proposal. Sophie, do you want to?
Yeah, I think this has been such an interesting and really lively debate. And I guess one of the things that I'm reflecting on is we're kind of talking about young people outside, so the people who are kind of protesting on the streets. And then we're saying the only way young people can be inside is as part of these kind of participative mechanisms, either the Y7 or as part of an observer constituency at the UNFCCC, or, you know, someone can come to you and listen to you and you can give them a nice speech, and that's how young people participate. The reality is neither of those gives the decision-making power to young people, and we spent so little time talking about how few young leaders there are. So 2.6% of the world's elected representatives are under the age of 30. That is despite the fact that pretty much 2/3 of the world's population is under the age of 30. And leadership, don't tell me that it's something that you gain through age, because I've met plenty of bad leaders who have been pretty old. So my argument is, actually, why don't we have more young people as leaders? I would love it if a G7 leader was 28. Because I reckon that G7 leader, I would hope, would be paving the way for the rest of us, thinking about how their actions impacted on young people. And I don't see enough of that kind of youth perspective in those decision-making tables, at those tables, either in world leader level, ministerial level, or kind of senior official level. We need more of that. And that's how I think we should improve youth participation.
Interesting proposal, more young leaders. And I have one more remark there. Yes,
yeah,
please.
Thanks. In parts, we are discussing this, or my impression is that you're discussing this out of a defensive sort of position. Yeah? While I think it's clear positionality always matters. I mean, everything we know depends on our own position, our own social position, how we know things, our perspectives on life. So it's also very clear that in a democratic context, we need to have different actor groups involved. But what I would encourage you to do is to focus a little more on those fields where young people simply know better than others. Yeah? So identify those fields where it's clear old people lack the expertise because they are outgrown it. They're not just older, but they are different people. Yeah? I can never go back to being 16. Maybe I don't even want to, but that's despite the fact, yeah, I'm a different person by now. I can't go back. So what are the fields of expertise, content-wise as well as process-wise, where young people simply know better than others? I would, that would sort of, rather than focusing on the defensive and on emphasizing the right to be heard, yeah? It's more about you simply co-setting the agenda. And I really think, while, without wanting to dominate, but I really think that the vote from 10 years onwards should be one of your recommendations.
All right, thank you. Gina,
just a short thing. I think it's really interesting what you said about these fears. There has been a study that was conducted last year by different universities, and they were making a study in 10 different countries, 10,000 young people, about climate anxiety in youth. 8 out of 10 youth had climate anxiety. Why? Because they think that they do not have a future, because they think that their society is doomed because of inaction of governments. And this is in our lives. I mean, it's a fear for me if I'm going to be able to have a kid or not. It's a fear. It's a fear of know if my parents in Colombia are going to have a good life in the future or not. It's a fear that I think competes us very, very good. Yeah.
Can I just hop in again? Sorry, oh, Adama, do you want to go? I guess my point sort of is, like, we actually heard that perspective a few times from the G7 last year. He said, like, stop talking to us about health. Like, you're not doctors. We don't want to hear from you about that. We actually just want to hear from you on education. And the young people we spoke to said, like, education isn't the only thing we're good for, and actually every health decision today is the thing that we inherit tomorrow. Every decision about the economy today is something we inherit tomorrow. Every issue is a youth issue because every issue is everyone's issue. And so I kind of hear what you're saying. There are things that we, you know, politicians love to talk to us about. I'm going to come back to education. They're always desperate for us, you know, to hear what young people think more about education. But I do really think kind of youth perspectives is the only way we will future-proof all of our policies, not just ones that directly relate to young people now.
All right. That's thank you. Oh, Adama, you wanted to react to that?
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. I just want to mention that intergenerational, like, sharing knowledge is really crucial when it comes to, like, climate issue, because it's going to impact for a long time. So we need to keep this habit of intergenerational challenge, sharing knowledge that will help to build also good leadership to, let's say, tackle the upcoming crisis that we will face. I think that is really important. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you everyone for the lively debate. We need to wrap up soon, and to do that, I want to bring it back to this year's G7 presidency. We've talked a lot about processes and how we can design these in general. Let's bring it back to this year's German G7 presidency, and let's hear from our panelists what their wishes, demands, ideas are for the German presidency. And Caro, do you want to start?
Yes. Yeah, so our proposal to the G7 leaders is the implementation of a youth check, of a so-called youth check, because in order to ensure intergenerational justice and youth-aware policies we've been talking about, the implementation of a youth check is needed on all political levels, because this allows to assess the impact which, for example, laws or also policy recommendations have on young people, like on children and on youth.
Adama, do you want to go next?
Okay, thank you. My recommendation will be to G7 to, let's say, support youth leaders to domesticate the policies. It's good to develop policies, but it's better to do action. And youth are really active in terms of, let's say, climate change. So we need the support from developing to developed countries. Youth are all around the world supporting climate issues. Thank you.
I will start saying that the lack of coherence between the discourse and timely action and implementation by governments is fueling a sense and a feeling of distrust and discontent, not only in youth, but in citizens of all ages. And promising words sound beautiful when you hear it, when you read them, but more strong are words that reflect consistent and coherent actions. So I call for the G7 presidency to guarantee present and future's right to a safe, a clean, and a sustainable environment for all, not only in the G7 and G20 territory, but beyond, to be coherent with that. And it is only possible with true leadership and with commitments materialize in concrete actions, in finance, in participatory spaces, in human rights. And I will make a call to stop talking about how we are going to focus our attention on recovering unequal and broken economic systems. We should be also talking about how are we going to recover our trust, our empathy. That would be my say.
Thank you, Gina. And Sophie.
I think I would probably have 3 recommendations for them. My first would be a kind of process one. So I would actually love it if Carolina and her co-chair were invited to the G7. That can happen, that does happen, you know, other groups can come and sit at that table and speak to world leaders. I would really love to see youth perspectives sat at that table with them. The second point is thematic. I would really like it if actually they started future-proofing the issues they were talking about. What you see the G7 do time and time again is kind of solve current crises, but never think about the crisis that might be coming up ahead. We saw that, you know, with the pandemic, they weren't thinking about the mental health repercussions and all of those type of things. And then the final thing is an outcome perspective. So to properly represent young people's needs. Young people are optimists, but they're also impatient. Get on with it. Do the stuff that you said that you were going to do last year or the year before or the year before. Don't give us another communique of nice new warm words. Get on with doing all the things that you said you would. And actually, I'd rather that over a new communique this year.
Thank you. Thank you very much to everyone. And I want to wrap up this round with an invitation. Because at the Global Solutions Initiative, we have an annual summit, the Global Solutions Summit, which brings together many of the world leaders in not only in politics, but also business, civil society, a lot of the think tanks that are present here. And I would love for all these 4 representatives of different youth organizations to be present and continue this dialogue with the decision makers. So please feel invited to come to the Global Solutions Summit next year in whatever format that will happen. And that is my concluding remarks. I want to thank you, everyone here on the panel, and everyone here in the room and at the screens for contributing to this.